The sheriff's cruiser idled at the end of the gravel drive, lights off engine ticking in the cold, while a man in a threadbare jacket stood between his daughter and a house the county had already written off as dead. Everyone assumed David Miller was just another broke, single dad who had made a bad bet. They were wrong. The wind cut across the Iowa fields like a blade, carrying the smell of rusted iron and old hay. The farmhouse sat low against the horizon windows, boarded paint bleached to the color of bone. The roof sagged in the middle like a tired spine. It was the kind of place people slowed down to stare at, then sped up to forget. David didn't look away. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel and shut off the truck. Emily shifted in the passenger seat, her small hands folded around a stuffed rabbit worn thin at the ears. She was 7 too quiet for her age, eyes always scanning as if listening for something that might break. "Is this it?" she asked. David nodded once. He didn't trust his voice. 6 weeks earlier, he had signed papers in a county office that smelled like stale coffee and dust. Tax foreclosure, as is. No warranties, no utilities. The clerk didn't bother to look up. $18,000, every dollar David had left, slid across the counter like a confession. People there thought he was desperate. He was. They didn't know why. David had built things his whole life. Houses, warehouses, a reputation that once meant his phone rang before sunrise. Then came the call that shattered time itself. His wife, a collapsed artery. No warning, no chance. 3 years ago, he stood in a hospital hallway and felt something inside him go quiet. He worked after that, but the work thinned. Contracts disappeared. Bills didn't. The house went next. The truck nearly followed. Now he stood on land no bank would touch with a child who watched his face for signs she pretended not to need. The sheriff's cruiser had been here earlier that week, checking on reports of copper theft in the area. David remembered the deputy's eyes, the pause when he saw Emily, the way he said, "You sure about this place?" without waiting for an answer. David opened the truck door. Gravel crunched loud in the quiet. The sound echoed farther than it should have. He smelled smoke. Real smoke. Wood, not electrical. His shoulders went tight. Emily noticed it too. She leaned forward, nose wrinkling. "Daddy, stay here," David said. The words came out calm, trained. "Lock the doors." He didn't wait to see her nod. He already knew she would. The porch boards complained under his boots. He counted steps without meaning to. Old habit. The front door hung slightly open, the latch scarred where it had been forced years ago. Inside the air was warmer than it had any right to be. Firelight flickered against the walls, throwing long shadows that moved like they were breathing. David stepped in and stopped. 2 women froze across the room. Not teenagers, not kids looking for trouble. Grown women, early 30s, maybe coats layered and patched eyes sharp with the kind of fear that comes from knowing exactly what you can lose. One stood in front of the other without thinking, shoulders squared, hands open where he could see them. "Please," the one in front said. Her voice didn't shake, but her breath did. "Please don't call the cops." The words hit the room and stayed there. David didn't move. He took in the details the way he always did. The floor swept clean. Cardboard sealed over broken glass. plastic sheeting tacked tight against drafts. The fireplace not just lit, but clean. Safe. Someone had done the work right. "Who are you?" he said. It came out flat, not angry. That made it worse. The second woman spoke quick, like she needed to get ahead of something. "We're not stealing. We thought it was abandoned. We've been careful. We can leave. Tonight." She glanced past him toward the truck outside. "We didn't know there was a kid." David's jaw tightened. He thought of the deputy, of the forms that turned people into problems with a stamp and a signature. He thought of what a trespassing charge did to a background check. He thought of the night he sold his wife's wedding ring for grocery money and didn't tell Emily where it went. "You picked the wrong house," he said. That was true in more ways than they knew. Behind him, the truck door creaked. He turned fast. Emily stood in the doorway, rabbit tucked under her arm, eyes wide but steady. She looked at the fire first, then the women. Not afraid. Curious. The room held its breath. Emily David said sharper than he meant to. "I was cold," she said simply. "And I saw the smoke." The woman in front swallowed. "We can go," she said again, softer now. Emily took a step inside anyway. She held her hands out toward the fire, then pulled them back, shy. "It's warm," she said. Then, because she was 7 and honest in the way that hurts adults, she asked, "Are you in trouble?" The question landed wrong. David felt it like a crack under his ribs. The women exchanged a look that was all history and no words. The one in back nodded once. "Yes," she said. "We are." David closed the door. The sound was final. He turned slow, measured. For a moment, he let them see what he was deciding. Not mercy, not kindness, calculation. He looked at their hands, their boots. The way the one called Megan, he would learn later, stood angled toward the back exit. The way Laura, the other one, kept her body between him and her sister without making a show of it. "You have 3 days," he said. "That's it." Laura blinked. 3 days to pack. "Find somewhere else. I don't care." He raised a hand when Megan opened her mouth. "You don't touch anything else. You don't bring anyone here. You don't light that fire when I'm not around." Megan nodded too fast. "We won't. We swear." David looked past them out the window to the fields folding into darkness. He saw the sheriff's cruiser in his mind, idling, waiting for a call that would be easy to make. He saw a future where Emily learned early that the law was something that happened to people like them. "You understand what happens if I call it in," he said quietly. "Yes," Laura said. Her voice was steady now. "We understand." Emily tugged at his sleeve. He looked down. Her eyes searched his face like she was reading a map she didn't trust. "Are they bad?" she whispered. David thought of men in clean suits who smiled while they took houses, of companies that blamed dead women for broken machines, of how easy it was to be called bad when you were just out of options. "No," he said. "They're not." The women exhaled at the same time, a sound like air escaping a locked room. David didn't sit. He didn't relax. He stood there, hands at his sides, feeling the weight of a choice everyone else would judge without knowing. Outside, the wind rattled the plastic on the windows. The fire popped once sharp. What none of them knew, not the women, not the deputy, not even Emily, was that David Miller was not just a man who built houses. He was a man who had signed off on projects that kept towns alive. A man who still carried numbers in his head that made banks listen when he decided to speak. He had gone quiet by choice, not by defeat. And in a room that smelled of smoke and second chances, the first move of a much larger game had just been made. The fire burned low through the night, and no one slept the way they pretended to. David stayed in the chair by the window boots, still on jacket zipped to his throat. The farmhouse creaked and sighed around him, like an animal remembering old injuries. Every sound registered: wind against plastic, a branch tapping the roof, the quiet weight of 3 other people breathing in a space that had not held breath for years. Laura sat on the far side of the room, back against the wall, knees drawn up, eyes never fully closing. Megan lay on the floor near the fireplace, coat folded under her head, one arm flung out as if she'd dropped mid-sentence. Exhaustion had taken her without permission. It always did eventually. Emily slept, curled on the couch, rabbit tucked beneath her chin. Fingers knotted in the frayed fabric, like it was an anchor. David watched them all and felt the pressure of time tighten. By dawn, the temperature dropped hard. The fire had died to a red scar in the stone. David rose quietly, joints protesting, and stepped outside. Frost glazed the fields thin and white, stretching to the tree line. His breath came out in short clouds. He stood there longer than necessary, letting the cold sharpen his thoughts. 3 days. He'd said it clean. Final. That was the rule he had given himself. 3 days to clear the house. 3 days to decide whether this was a mistake he could still reverse. He knew how this usually ended. A call, paperwork, a cruiser. People removed with a politeness that cut deeper than shouting. He had been on the other side of that line, once standing in a driveway, while a man in uniform explained procedures like they were weather patterns. Behind him, the door creaked. Laura stepped out onto the porch, pulling her coat tight. She stopped when she saw him, then nodded once, respectful. Morning. David didn't answer right away. He looked at her hands. They were cracked red from cold and work. Someone who had been fixing things without gloves because gloves cost money. You up early, he said finally. She shrugged. Didn't really sleep. He waited. People always filled silence if you let them. We'll be gone, she said. Before the 3 days. David turned then. He studied her face in the grey light, older than he'd first thought. Lines at the mouth that didn't belong to 32. You don't have anywhere to go. Her jaw tightened. She didn't deny it. We'll figure something out. That's what everyone says right before they don't. She met his eyes. There was no defiance there. Just something like pride trying not to break. You already gave us more than you had to. David almost laughed. He didn't. I gave you time. That's more than most. Inside, Emily stirred. The sound pulled at him. He turned away first. They worked that morning without talking much. David showed them what he expected. Not instructions. Standards. The roof over the back room leaked where rot had eaten through the beam. He marked it with a piece of chalk and watched how Laura followed his hand, how she traced the problem without being told. She climbed the ladder, steady. Cautious, tested the wood with the heel of her boot before committing weight. "You've done this before," David said. "Different version," she replied. "Different places." Megan came back from the barn carrying salvaged boards, face flushed from cold eyes alert, now that sleep had loosened its grip. She moved fast, efficient, organizing what could be used and what couldn't. When she thought David wasn't watching, she wiped dust off an old window frame and leaned her forehead against it for a moment, breathing. Emily hovered near the door, watching everything with quiet intensity. She asked questions David answered in half words. Laura answered the rest. Megan showed her how to sort nails by size, how to tell which ones would snap if you pushed too hard. Emily listened like it mattered. By afternoon, the sound of a truck approached on the gravel road. David stiffened before he saw it. He knew the engine. Older model. County. The sheriff's pickup rolled to a stop just short of the porch. Deputy Carl Jennings stepped out, hat low face, already set in something between concern and suspicion. He took in the ladder, the boards, the women, the child. His eyes lingered on Megan. A beat too long, then shifted to David. "Afternoon," Carl said. "Got a call about smoke." David nodded once. "Fireplace." Carl glanced toward the chimney, then back. "Place been empty a long time. Not anymore." Silence stretched. The wind picked up. Plastic rattled. Carl shifted his weight. "You the owner?" "Yes, you sure about that?" David met his gaze. There it was. The assumption. The easy one. County records would say so. Carl hesitated. "Mind if I ask who they are?" Megan went still. Laura stepped half a pace forward without thinking. "They're helping me," David said. "Temporary." Carl looked at Emily. She stared back, chin-lifted rabbit tucked under her arm like armor. Something in Carl's expression softened. "Not enough." "Just doing my job," he said. "We've had issues out here. Squatting. Theft." David leaned against the porch rail. "Casual. Controlled. Nothing's missing." Carl studied him. Really studied him now. "You got utilities coming back on in time?" Carl nodded slowly. He looked at Laura again, then Megan. "You ladies planning on staying?" Before either of them could answer, David said, "No." The word fell clean. Megan flinched. Laura didn't. Carl seemed satisfied. "All right, then." He tipped his hat toward Emily. "Stay warm, kid." When the truck pulled away, the house felt smaller. Megan let out a breath she'd been holding too long. "Thank you," she said to David, then stopped herself. "I mean," for not David cut her off with a look. "Don't." The rest of the day moved faster. Too fast. They worked through cold fingers and stiff joints, the sun dropping early shadows lengthening inside the house. David noticed how Laura checked the fire twice before leaving it, how Megan flinched at every engine sound, how Emily grew quiet as evening came, eyes following the door. After dinner, a thin stew stretched farther than it should have. Emily sat beside David on the steps. Her legs dangled boots not quite touching the floor. "Are they leaving tomorrow?" she asked. "Soon." Emily nodded, accepting the answer without understanding it. She traced a crack in the wood with her finger. "They're not bad," she said again, as if repeating it might make it permanent. David looked at the dark beyond the windows. He thought of the call he hadn't made, of the one he still could, of how some lines once crossed never really faded. Inside, Laura and Megan packed quietly, folding what little they owned with care that bordered on ritual. Every movement said they had done this before, too many times. That night, David stood alone in the kitchen, long after everyone else had gone to their corners. He rested his hand on the counter, feeling the grain, the age. He thought of the company he'd once walked away from without a word, of the calls that still went unanswered, because silence was safer. 3 days, he reminded himself. That was the rule. Outside, a light flicked on across the field. A neighbor, maybe. Watching, always watching. David turned off the lantern and let the darkness settle. Somewhere in the house a floorboard creaked, a breath caught. Time moved forward, whether he was ready or not. And the next move, he knew, would cost more than time. The third morning broke with the sound of metal striking stone, sharp and deliberate, echoing through the hollow bones of the farmhouse. David was already awake. He had been awake for hours, sitting at the small table with a yellow legal pad untouched in front of him, coffee gone cold. He knew that sound. It wasn't careless. It wasn't panic. It was work being done by someone who needed to finish before time ran out. He stepped outside and found Laura at the edge of the property line, swinging a sledgehammer against a concrete footing half buried in weeds. Each strike was controlled, spaced, precise. She paused only to catch her breath, wiped her sleeve across her mouth, then swung again. "You don't need to do that," David said. Laura stopped mid-motion. The hammer rested against the ground. She didn't turn around right away. "It's in the way," she said. "You won't be able to grade the soil right with it there." David walked closer. Frost still clung to the grass, crunching under his boots. "I didn't ask you to clear the boundary. You didn't ask us to fix the fireplace, either," she said. Then she finally turned eyes steady. "But you needed it." That word landed heavier than it should have. Needed. From the porch, Megan watched silently, arms folded tight around herself. Emily sat on the steps beside her shoes, scuffing the wood. She was quieter than yesterday. The kind of quiet that meant she was paying attention. "You said 3 days," Megan called out. Her voice carried an edge, now not defiant, just braced. "This is day 3. David nodded once. "I know." Laura picked up the hammer again. "Then let us finish. Finish what David thought." There was no finish to this, just lines drawn, and erased and drawn again, until someone decided they were done pretending. By late morning, a second truck appeared on the gravel road. Not county this time. White, unmarked. It rolled past the farmhouse, slowed, then turned around and came back. David felt it before he saw it. The tightening behind the eyes, the shift in the air. The truck stopped near the barn. A man stepped out, mid-40s, clean jacket boots, too new for the ground he was standing on. He didn't look lost. He looked certain. "Morning," the man said, smiling like it was a courtesy, not a question. "Name's Ray Collins. I represent Prairie Ridge Holdings." David didn't offer his hand. "Never heard of it." Ray smiled wider. Most people haven't. We acquire distressed properties, agricultural, transitional land. Megan went rigid. Laura's grip tightened on the hammer. This land isn't for sale, David said. Ray glanced at the farmhouse, the boards, the plastic. County records say it was acquired at foreclosure 6 weeks ago. Correct. And county records also show a pending environmental review on this parcel. Ray pulled a folded paper from his jacket, didn't hand it over. Historical runoff, old fuel tanks. If that review doesn't clear, you won't be able to secure permits or utilities. David felt Emily's eyes on him. He didn't look back. You're trespassing, David said calmly. Ray laughed soft. Not yet. Laura stepped forward. You should leave. Ray's gaze slid to her, lingered too long. And you are. No one you need to worry about. Ray nodded slowly. Funny thing about people with nothing to lose, he said. They're usually the ones standing in the way. David took one step closer. The ground between them seemed to contract. You came out here for a reason. Say it. Ray sighed like a man disappointed by formality. We're offering a buyout. Quiet. Quick. Cash. Enough to make your troubles go away. What troubles Ray glanced at the house again. This place isn't safe for a child. Not with that inspection hanging over it. Not with the county watching. Accidents happen out here. Megan inhaled sharply. Laura's jaw clenched. Emily stood up. David didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. You should leave now. Ray met his gaze. Something flickered there. Calculation. You have 3 days before the review moves forward. After that, this land becomes a liability. He folded the paper again, tucked it away. Think about it. When the truck pulled off, the sound of gravel felt louder than it should have. Emily broke the silence. Daddy, she said. Who was that man? David knelt in front of her. He took her hands cold and small in his own. Someone who thinks everything has a price. Does it? David held her gaze. He thought of numbers, of contracts, of nights spent deciding which bills could wait. No, he said. Not everything. Laura leaned against the porch rail, the hammer resting at her feet. That wasn't random. No, David said. It wasn't. Megan hugged herself tighter. They know about us. They know about the land, David replied. Then after a pause, and now they know I won't move easily. The rest of the day unraveled faster than the others. A call from the county office that went unanswered. Another truck on the road that didn't stop, but slowed. A neighbor watching from a distance pretending to fix a fence that didn't need fixing. By dusk, Laura and Megan packed what little they had left. They moved with quiet efficiency, the kind born of practice. Emily followed them room to room, asking questions no one answered. David stood in the kitchen staring at the phone on the counter. He could call the sheriff. He could call the county. He could call people whose numbers he had not used in years. He picked up the phone. Set it down. Picked it up again. Outside, Laura hesitated at the edge of the porch. She turned back once. We didn't mean to cause trouble. David met her eyes. He saw exhaustion there, and resolve, and something else. Recognition. I know, he said. Megan's voice shook despite her effort. "We'll be gone before dark." Emily stepped forward without asking. She wrapped her arms around Laura's waist, pressed her face into the worn fabric of her coat. Laura froze, then slowly, carefully rested a hand on the child's back. David felt something inside him give way. Not break. Shift. "Wait," he said. They all looked at him. "You leave tonight," he continued, "and you walk straight into whatever they have planned. Or you stay." He paused. The weight of the words pressed down hard. "But if you stay, this stops being temporary." Ray's smile flashed in his mind. The paper folded just so. The threat wrapped in politeness. "If you stay," David said, "we do this right. Contracts, paperwork, boundaries." He looked at Laura, at Megan. No running. Silence stretched. The sky darkened. Somewhere far off, an engine started. Laura spoke first. "You don't even know who you're fighting." David's expression didn't change. "I do." Megan searched his face. "Why would you do this?" David glanced down at Emily, who stood between them. Rabbit clutched tight, eyes fierce, in a way that surprised even him. He thought of the man in the white truck, of the county office, of how easy it would be to step aside. "Because they expect me to," he said quietly. "And I'm tired of letting people like that decide what happens next." The wind rose, rattling the plastic over the windows. The farmhouse stood battered but unyielding. And for the first time since he had signed those papers 6 weeks ago, David Miller didn't feel like he was reacting. He was choosing. The contract printer jammed twice before it finally spat out the last page, the sound sharp in the quiet kitchen, like a warning no one spoke aloud. David smoothed the paper with his palm eyes, scanning every line, even though he knew it by memory. Temporary occupancy agreement, work exchange, no tenancy rights, termination clause clear and cold. He had written it himself, then had a friend in Des Moines who owed him a favor. Rewrite it so it would hold up if someone tried to lean on it. It was clean. It was fair. It was a line in the ground. Laura stood at the counter reading the page upside down without touching it. Megan paced near the door, stopping every few steps like she expected someone to knock. Emily sat on the floor with her rabbit, drawing slow circles in the dust with her finger. "You don't have to sign," Laura said finally. David didn't look up. "If you stay, we do it right." Megan stopped pacing. "And if we don't, then you leave before dark." The word leave sat heavy. Emily looked up, eyes sharp, then dropped her gaze again without speaking. Laura took the pen. Her hand hovered. "This doesn't make us safe." David met her eyes. "Nothing does. It just makes us honest." She signed. The pen scratched loud in the room. Megan hesitated longer, jaw tight, then signed beneath her sister's name. When she finished, she let out a breath that sounded like she'd been holding it for years. Outside, a truck slowed on the road. Didn't stop. Just enough to be seen. They worked through the afternoon with a different energy, focused, intent. David showed them where to brace the back wall, how to anchor the temporary supports so the wind wouldn't take them in the night. Laura asked fewer questions now, but the ones she asked cut straight to the problem. Megan kept watch from the window when she wasn't hauling debris, eyes flicking to the road every time gravel shifted. Emily stayed close to David. Too close. Her small hand found his sleeve whenever a shadow moved wrong. He felt the weight of that grip, like a promise he hadn't known he was making. At dusk, headlights swept the front of the house. David was on the ladder when the light hit the boards, bright and deliberate. He climbed down, slow heart, steady, but alert. Laura was already moving toward the porch. Megan froze, then followed. The car stopped. A county sedan this time. Beige. Official. A woman stepped out. Late 40s. Hair pulled back tight. Clipboard tucked under her arm like a shield. She didn't smile. "David Miller," she said. "Not a question. I'm Elaine Harper with the County Environmental Office." David nodded. "You're early." Her eyes flicked to the house, the plastic, the ladder, the women. They sharpened. "We had a report." "Of course you did." Elaine took a step closer. "We need to conduct a preliminary assessment. There's concern about contamination." Laura spoke before David could stop her. "This land hasn't been touched in years." Elaine glanced at her. "And you are?" David stepped in. "They're here with my permission." Elaine's pen paused over the clipboard. "That's not advisable." David held her gaze. "Neither is ignoring problems." Elaine studied him now, really looked. The worn jacket, the calm, the way he stood like he expected pushback and had already measured it. "This review can take months," she said. "During that time, occupancy is discouraged." "Discouraged isn't prohibited." Elaine's lips thinned. "You're aware of the risks?" "Yes." Emily appeared at David's side without a sound. She leaned into him, eyes fixed on Elaine. The woman's gaze softened, despite herself. "I'll need access to the property," Elaine said. "Tomorrow." David nodded. "I'll be here." Elaine hesitated, then scribbled something on her clipboard. "Be careful," she said quietly. "This kind of interest doesn't happen by accident." David watched her leave. The car pulled away, dust hanging in the air longer than it should have. Night came fast. Too fast. They ate in silence, the stew thicker now, stretched again. Megan barely touched hers. Laura watched the door. Emily pushed food around her bowl until David noticed. "Eat," he said gently. "I'm not hungry." He didn't press. He knew that look. Afterward, David sat at the table with the contract copies, sliding them into a folder. Laura lingered nearby. "You didn't have to stand between us and her," she said. "Yes," David replied. "I did." Laura leaned back against the counter. "They're going to push harder." David nodded. "That's how people like that work." Megan hovered near the window. "Ray Collins doesn't scare easily." David looked up. "You know him?" Megan's mouth tightened. "Not personally. But I've seen what happens when companies decide they want something. They make it messy. They make it look like your fault." Emily shifted in her chair. "Are we in trouble again?" David turned fully toward her. He knelt so they were eye level. "No," he said. He made his voice steady. "We're just dealing with people who don't like being told no." Emily considered that. Like when the teacher says clean up and some kids don't want to. David smiled despite himself. Something like that. Later, when the house settled and the fire burned low, Laura sat on the porch steps alone. David joined her without asking. The stars were sharp, the cold creeping back in. You could still walk away, Laura said. Sell. Take their money. David stared out at the fields. They wouldn't offer if they didn't stand to make more. And if they make it impossible, David's jaw set. Then they try. Laura studied him in the starlight. You don't act like someone who's cornered. David exhaled slowly. I've been cornered before. Inside, Megan paced the back room, every nerve lit. She stopped when Emily appeared in the doorway, rabbit clutched tight. Can I sleep here? Emily asked softly. Megan's chest tightened. Of course. Emily crawled onto the mattress, curled on her side. Megan lay stiff beside her, listening to the small, even breaths. She hadn't shared a room with a child since her sister was small. She hadn't planned on this feeling. Outside, headlights appeared again, farther off. This time passing slow, then gone. David stood at the window long after everyone else had retreated. He thought of Ray Collins, of Elaine's warning, of the way pressure came disguised as procedure. He picked up his phone, scrolled, names he hadn't touched in years, men who remembered him as someone who delivered, who didn't bluff. He didn't call yet. In the quiet, the farmhouse held together with borrowed time and stubborn will. The agreement lay signed and waiting. The county was watching. Prairie Ridge was circling. And David Miller, written off by everyone who saw only a broken house and a tired man, stood exactly where he had chosen to stand. Not hiding, not running. Ready. The inspection began with the sound of boots on dirt and the quiet hum of a county truck pulling in just after sunrise. Elaine Harper arrived with 2 men, this time both carrying equipment cases, both careful not to look anyone in the eye for too long. David stood on the porch with his coffee untouched, jacket zipped, watching the way they spread out. Not random. Deliberate. One went straight for the soil near the barn. The other headed toward the old fuel shed behind the house. Laura noticed it too. They already know where to look, she said under her breath. David didn't answer. He was watching Elaine. She moved differently than Ray Collins. No smile, no theatrics. But there was pressure in her posture, like she was standing between 2 forces and didn't like either one. Emily hovered behind David. Her fingers looped through the back of his belt. Megan stood a few steps away, arms folded tight, eyes tracking every movement like she was counting exits. Elaine stopped in front of David. We'll need access to the crawl space. You'll have it. And the shed. Careful, David said. The latch sticks. Elaine nodded, then hesitated. This process can take time. I know. She looked past him at the women. They shouldn't be here. They are. Elaine sighed just once. Then I hope you understand what you're risking. David met her gaze. I do. The morning dragged. Soil samples bagged and labeled. Measurements taken. Notes scribbled. Every scrape of metal against stone tightened something in David's chest. He had seen this dance before. Inspectors didn't just find problems. They created leverage. Halfway through, a black SUV rolled slowly past the road. Didn't stop. Didn't need to. Megan stiffened. Laura's hand curled into a fist. "They're watching," Megan whispered. "Yes," David said. "Let them." By noon, Elaine gathered her team. "We'll have preliminary results within 10 business days. And until then, she said carefully, "I would advise against further construction." David nodded. He didn't argue. Elaine studied him a moment longer, then lowered her voice. "You should know," she said, "Prairie Ridge has been calling my office." I assumed. "They're pushing for expedited action." David's expression didn't change. "And are you giving it to them?" Elaine held his gaze. "No." That surprised him. It showed on his face for half a second before he buried it. "I'm not in the business of being used," she continued. "But that doesn't mean they'll stop." David inclined his head. "Thank you." When they left, the house felt exposed, like something had been taken without anyone touching it. They worked anyway. Quiet tasks, reinforcing, cleaning, preparing for something none of them could name yet. Emily stayed inside most of the afternoon, drawing on scrap paper, the rabbit never leaving her side. Megan checked the road every few minutes. Near sunset, David's phone buzzed. Unknown number. He stepped away before answering. "Miller," David Ray Collins said smoothly. "I was beginning to think you didn't get my message. I got it. And I'm still here." Ray chuckled. "You're stubborn." "Careful," David replied. "That's usually the part where people make mistakes." Ray's voice cooled. "You're standing in the way of something bigger than you." David leaned against the fence, eyes on the horizon. "So are you." Silence crackled over the line. "We're prepared to be generous," Ray said finally. "Enough for you to start over somewhere else. Somewhere safe. Safe for who? For your daughter." That did it. David's grip tightened. "You don't get to use her." Ray exhaled. "Then you leave me no choice." The call ended. David stood there a long moment, the phone heavy in his hand. When he turned back, Laura was watching him from the porch. She didn't ask. She didn't need to. That night, the power cut out. The lights flickered once, twice, then died. The house dropped into darkness, so sudden, Emily gasped. Megan moved instantly, lighting the lantern, setting it on the table with hands that shook just a little. "It's not a storm," Laura said. She was already at the window. David checked the breaker. Nothing tripped. He stepped outside. The sky was clear. Too clear. Down the road, the neighbor's house glowed warm and steady. "Dad," Emily whispered. "What's happening?" David knelt, voice low and calm. Sometimes lines fail, but theirs didn't. He didn't answer. They sat together in the lantern-light shadows, stretched tall on the walls. The fire crackled, the only sound that felt reliable. Emily eventually fell asleep, curled against Laura's side. Head, heavy breath, slow. Laura froze at first, then adjusted carefully, one arm settling protectively around the child without thinking. Megan watched something soft and painful crossing her face. Later, when Emily was moved gently to the couch, Laura joined David outside. The cold bit harder now. The road lay empty. "They're escalating," she said. "Yes," And you still haven't told us everything. David didn't deny it. Some things attract attention, he said, even when you don't want them to. Laura studied him. What kind of attention? The words sat between them, heavy, dangerous. Before he could answer, headlights appeared again. This time they stopped. A pickup pulled into the drive. Not county, not Prairie Ridge. Older, familiar. A man stepped out, broad-shouldered grey at the temples, wearing a jacket David recognized instantly. "Thought that was your truck," the man said. "Haven't seen you around in years." David's expression shifted. Not relief. Recognition. Tom. Tom Harris, former union rep, current city council member. Someone who remembered exactly what David Miller had built and how fast he'd disappeared. Tom looked at the house, the women, the lantern light inside. "Got a call," Tom said. "Said you were having trouble." David didn't ask who called. He already knew. Tom leaned in, voice low. "Prairie Ridge's been sniffing around town. They don't like being told no." Laura watched the exchange the way David stood differently now, like someone who hadn't forgotten how to hold ground. "You should come to the council meeting tomorrow," Tom said. "Bring your paperwork." David nodded once. "I will." When Tom drove off, Laura exhaled slowly. "You know people." David stared at the dark fields. "I used to." Inside, Megan paced. Emily stirred, murmuring in her sleep. The power stayed out. David stepped back into the house, closing the door against the cold. He looked at the women, at the child, at the place that had become something more dangerous than shelter. "This isn't just about the land," Megan said quietly. "No," David replied. "It hasn't been for a while." He looked down at Emily asleep, but frowning, and felt the weight of the next move settle in. The power would come back. Or it wouldn't. Either way, Prairie Ridge had shown its hand. And David Miller was done pretending he didn't still know how to play. The council chamber smelled like old wood floor polish and impatience, and David felt every eye follow him as he stepped inside with Emily's small hand wrapped around his fingers. People remembered him here, not as the man he was now in a worn jacket with dust on his boots, but as the man who once stood at the front of rooms like this and told grown men where to sign. That memory lingered in the air, faint but undeniable, and it made people uncomfortable. Tom Harris waved him over to the second row. Laura and Megan slid in beside them, stiff-backed, alert. Emily climbed onto the chair and swung her legs, whispering questions David answered, with a nod or a squeeze of her hand. Across the room, a pair of Prairie Ridge representatives sat together. Suits pressed, expressions neutral. Ray Collins wasn't there. That felt intentional. The meeting dragged through zoning updates and road repairs before the agenda shifted. David didn't miss the subtle change in tone. Elaine Harper sat near the back clipboard in her lap, eyes fixed forward. Next item, the council chair said, "Environmental review concerns regarding the Miller property." A murmur rippled through the room. David stood before his name was called. He didn't rush. He let the moment stretch. He felt Laura's eyes on his back, Megan's tension beside him, Emily's grip tighten. My name is David Miller, he said, his voice carried without effort. I purchased the property legally through county foreclosure. I'm aware of the review. I'm cooperating fully. One of the Prairie Ridge men cleared his throat. With respect, the land poses a potential risk. There are children involved. David turned toward him slowly. There are always children involved. The question is whether you protect them or use them. Silence fell hard. David continued, measured. I've rebuilt structures in this county that passed stricter inspections than this one ever will. I've remediated sites worse than what you're implying, and I've done it without cutting corners. The chair leaned forward. Mr. Miller, are you representing yourself? David met his gaze. No. A pause. Subtle. Electric. I'm representing a holding trust, David said. One that acquired that property through me. Whispers broke out. Prairie Ridge shifted in their seats. Elaine's head lifted sharply. The chair frowned. You'll need to clarify. I will, David said. But first, I want it on record that Prairie Ridge has attempted to pressure county offices, has made unsolicited buyout offers, and has interfered with utilities on a legally occupied property. The Prairie Ridge man stood halfway. That's a serious accusation. So is endangering a child, David replied without raising his voice. Emily swung her legs harder. She watched the room with wide, curious eyes, sensing something impotent without understanding it. Elaine stood then. For the record, she said, my office has received multiple communications from Prairie Ridge regarding expedited enforcement. Those requests were denied. The room shifted again, this time toward David. He nodded once in her direction, acknowledgement without gratitude. Then he reached into his jacket and set a thin folder on the table. The trust I represent has capital reserves sufficient to cover full remediation if required, he said. But more importantly, it has standing, which means any attempt to force sale before review completion will be challenged. The chair glanced at the folder. You're asking us to believe. David cut in gently. I'm asking you to check. The meeting ended soon after, not with resolution, but with momentum, and David felt it like a current under his feet. Prairie Ridge left quickly, faces tight. Elaine lingered watching him from across the room, like she was recalibrating an equation. Outside, the air felt different, sharper, alive. Laura stopped him near the steps. You didn't tell us about a trust. No, David said. I didn't. Megan's voice was low. What does that mean? It means David replied. They thought I was alone. Emily tugged his sleeve. Daddy, did we win? David knelt, meeting her eyes. We didn't lose. That night, the power came back on without warning. The lights flared to life, sudden and almost violent. Megan flinched. Laura exhaled slowly. They're backing off, Megan said. For now, David replied. They ate late, quiet, thoughtful. Emily talked about the chairs in the meeting room, how big they were, how important everyone looked. She fell asleep mid-sentence, head resting against David's arm. After she was settled, Laura stood with him in the kitchen, hands wrapped around a mug she wasn't drinking from. You knew they'd come after the land? Yes. And you bought it anyway? Yes. Why? David stared at the counter, the grain worn smooth by time. Because they've been circling this county for years. Buying quiet. Pushing people out one inspection at a time. Because someone needed to say no. Laura studied him. You're not just a contractor. David didn't answer. Outside, tires crunched on gravel. Megan was at the window first. It's him. Ray Collins stepped out of the black SUV, smile gone, posture stiff. He didn't knock. He waited. David opened the door and stepped onto the porch, closing it behind him. Ray didn't bother with pleasantries. You blindsided us. David folded his arms. You underestimated me. Ray laughed sharp. You think a council meeting changes the math. It changes the timing. Ray's eyes flicked to the house. You're risking people who don't belong in this. David leaned closer, voice low. They belong exactly where they are. Ray's jaw tightened. You don't get to rewrite how this works. David held his gaze. I already did. For a moment, Ray looked like he might say something else. Then he stepped back. This isn't over. It never is, David replied. When Ray drove off, the road felt quieter than before. Megan joined him on the porch. You scared him. David shook his head. No. I reminded him. Inside, Laura watched them through the window, arms crossed, mind racing. She had seen power before. This was different. This was controlled. Patient. David came back in and locked the door. He rested his hand on it for a moment longer than necessary. They're going to look deeper now, Laura said. Yes. And what happens when they find out who you really are? David met her eyes. There it was, the question he'd been avoiding. They already know enough, he said. The rest doesn't matter yet. Megan frowned. Yet. David looked toward the room where Emily slept, the steady rise and fall of her chest visible in the low light. There's a point, he said quietly, where you stop hiding because it's easier and start standing because it's necessary. Laura nodded slowly. And we're past that point. Yes, David said. We are. Outside the farmhouse stood lit against the dark fields, no longer invisible. The county was watching. Prairie Ridge was angry. Lines had been drawn where none existed before. And David Miller, long dismissed as a man who had lost everything, finally allowed himself one small, dangerous truth. He hadn't lost it. He had been waiting. The first lawsuit arrived by certified mail on a grey Tuesday morning, the envelope stiff and heavy, like it already knew it carried bad news. David signed for it without expression, thanked the postal clerk, and set it on the kitchen table, where the grain of the wood showed every scratch and scar. Laura and Megan watched from opposite sides of the room, both recognizing the weight of that paper before it was opened. Emily sat cross-legged on the floor, lining up toy cars she'd found in a box from the barn. She looked up. Is that more grown-up stuff? Yes, David said. But it's nothing for you to worry about. She accepted that with a nod and went back to her cars, pushing one slowly, deliberately, as if testing how far it could go before something stopped it. David opened the envelope. Prairie Ridge. Holdings versus Miller Property. Trust. Injunction request. Temporary restraining order. Cease all construction. Vacate premises pending review. Megan exhaled sharply. They're trying to freeze us out. Yes, David said. On paper. Laura leaned forward, reading over his shoulder. Her jaw tightened, not in fear, but in recognition. They want us gone, without ever touching us. David folded the pages once precise. They want us to panic. Outside, another truck slowed on the road. Didn't stop. Didn't need to. By afternoon, the pressure multiplied. A notice from the utility company citing an administrative error. A voicemail from an insurance office asking questions they'd never asked before. A neighbor stopping by under the pretense of borrowing a tool, eyes darting, voice low. Word traveled fast in small towns, especially when money was involved. Megan paced. Laura stayed still, which worried David more. That evening, Tom Harris pulled into the drive again, this time without calling ahead. He stepped inside, removed his jacket, and didn't bother with small talk. They filed, he said. I know. They're trying to make an example. David nodded. They always do. Tom glanced at Laura and Megan, then at Emily, now coloring at the table. You sure you want them here for this? David didn't hesitate. Yes. Tom studied him. You've always been stubborn. Selective, David replied. Tom sighed. Counsel can slow things, but a judge is a different animal. David met his eyes. Then I'll remind the judge who they're dealing with. Tom hesitated. You're really going to bring it all out? David looked toward Emily, then back. Not everything. Just enough. That night, after Emily was asleep, David gathered Laura and Megan in the kitchen. The lantern was off now, the light steady, but the air felt tighter than it had during the blackout. They're going to push until something breaks, David said, which means we need to stop reacting. Laura crossed her arms. What does that look like? It looks like we go on offense. Megan frowned. We don't have their resources. David's mouth curved slightly. Not a smile. You'd be surprised. He opened a laptop he hadn't touched in years. The screen lit his face differently, younger, sharper. He typed with muscle memory fingers moving fast. Names appeared. Documents, spreadsheets, old email threads. Laura leaned closer. What is all this? Records, David said. Projects Prairie Ridge acquired over the last 10 years. Sites that failed inspections. Remediation funds that vanished. Shell companies. Megan's breath caught. You kept this. I never throw anything away, David replied. Laura stared at the screen. You didn't lose your company. David paused. I stepped back. Why? Because I saw where it was heading, he said. And I didn't want my daughter growing up in the middle of it. Megan swallowed. And now, David said, they came to me. The next day, David drove into town alone. He parked across from a brick building with his trust's name on a small plaque no one paid attention to anymore. Inside, a receptionist blinked when she saw him. I'm here to see the board, David said. Her eyes widened. They didn't say I know. By evening, word spread. Not loudly, quietly. Phones rang in places Prairie Ridge didn't expect. Old partners surfaced. Attorneys who remembered favors called in and not returned. the kind of movement that didn't show up on radar until it was too late. Back at the farmhouse, Laura and Megan felt the shift before they understood it. Cars passed less often. The road felt less hostile. Even the air seemed to ease just slightly. Emily noticed first. "It's quieter," she said at dinner. "Yes," David replied. "For now." 2 days later, Prairie Ridge amended their filing. The restraining order was withdrawn. Publicly, they cited procedural errors. Privately, they went silent. Megan stared at the noticed disbelief plain on her face. "That's it?" "No," David said. "That's a pause." Laura studied him. "You planned this?" "I prepared," David corrected. That night, Ray Collins didn't come. Instead, a different man called. Older. Calmer. His voice carried respect edged with warning. "We'd like to talk," the man said. David leaned against the counterphone to his ear. "You already did. Not like this." "Then come correct." When the call ended, Laura watched him carefully. "They're scared." David shook his head. "They're cautious." Emily tugged his sleeve. "Did we fix it?" David knelt, brushing hair from her eyes. "We fixed part of it. What about the rest?" David smiled faintly. "The rest takes time." Later, Laura stood alone on the porch watching the fields settle into night. Megan joined her, leaning on the rail. "You ever think about how close we were to leaving?" Megan said. Laura nodded. "Every minute." Megan looked back through the window at David, at the way he moved through the house, now unhurried, controlled. He didn't just save us. Laura didn't answer right away. She thought of the hammer, the contract, the night Emily fell asleep against her without asking. "No," she said, finally. "He chose us." Inside, David stood at the table reviewing documents by lamplight. He looked tired, but it was a good tired, the kind that came from effort, not fear. The farmhouse held steady under the stars, not untouched, not unmarked, but standing. And somewhere beyond the fields, Prairie Ridge recalculated. They always did. What they hadn't counted on was a man who no longer needed their approval, their money, or their permission. David Miller closed the laptop and turned off the light. The game had changed, and this time he was playing to finish it. The silence that followed Prairie Ridge's retreat felt heavier than the noise had ever been. David noticed it first in the mornings, when the road stayed empty longer than usual, and the fields lay undisturbed, as if the land itself was waiting to see what would happen next. No trucks slowed, no engines idled. Even the wind seemed to move with restraint. Laura felt it in her hands. She woke before dawn and found herself standing still. Tools laid out but untouched, unsure where to begin, now that every movement no longer felt like defiance. Megan felt it in her chest, a tension she'd carried so long it had become familiar now, loosening in ways that left her unsteady. Emily noticed it in the smallest way. "Nobody's watching today," she said, one morning peering through the window as she ate her cereal. David looked out at the empty road. That doesn't mean they're gone. But even he couldn't deny the shift. The pressure had changed shape. The amended filing arrived 3 days later, thinner than the first envelope, quieter. Prairie Ridge formally withdrew their objections pending further internal review. No apology, no explanation. Just distance. Megan read it twice, then a third time. They're stepping back. For now, David said. Laura folded the paper carefully as if it might shatter. They don't do that unless something forces them. Yes, David replied. Or someone. That afternoon, Elaine Harper returned alone. No equipment, no clipboard. She stood on the porch with her hands tucked into her coat, eyes scanning the work they'd done since her last visit. You moved faster than I expected, she said. David nodded. So did they. Elaine hesitated. Off the record, she said quietly. I was told to close the file. Megan stiffened. Close it. Elaine met her gaze. For now. No findings, no violations. Laura exhaled slowly. That's it. Elaine shook her head. It's never it. Her eyes returned to David. But you bought time. She turned to leave, then paused. Be careful what you build on borrowed ground. When she drove away, the house felt warmer, not safer, just steadier. Work resumed, but it was different now. No longer frantic, no longer defensive. David let Laura take the lead on parts of the structure he would have insisted on controlling before. He watched how she measured twice cut, once corrected mistakes without apology. Megan organized materials, kept records, handled calls from local suppliers who had suddenly become more cooperative. Emily thrived in the rhythm. She learned the names of tools, learned which questions to ask and which to save for later. She laughed more, slept deeper. One evening as the sun bled into the fields, David found Laura sitting on the porch steps, staring at the horizon. You okay? He asked. She nodded slowly. I don't know how to be when I'm not waiting for the next thing to go wrong. David sat beside her. That doesn't go away overnight. Laura swallowed. Every place we've been, there was always an end date. Someone else's decision. And now, she said, it feels like we're allowed to exist. David looked out at the darkening fields. That's usually when people realize how much they've been holding their breath. Inside, Megan and Emily worked on a puzzle at the table. Emily's brow furrowed in concentration. This piece doesn't fit, she declared. Megan smiled gently. Then it belongs somewhere else. Emily considered that, then nodded, trying again. Later that night, David received another call. This time, the number wasn't hidden. Mr. Miller, the voice said. Older than Ray. Measured. Controlled. This is Arthur Klein. David recognized the name immediately. Prairie Ridge's senior counsel. The man behind the curtain. I thought you might call, David said. Arthur didn't bother with pleasantries. You've made your point. I haven't started, David replied. A pause. We're prepared to discuss terms. David leaned against the counter. There are no terms. Everyone has terms. Not this time. Arthur's voice tightened just slightly. You're protecting people who will cost you. David glanced toward the living room where Emily laughed at something Megan had said. I'm investing, he said. There's a difference. Silence stretched. You were once very good at this, Arthur said finally. You could have been one of us. I was, David replied. That's why I'm not anymore. The line went dead. That night, Laura couldn't sleep. She found David in the kitchen staring at a blueprint he wasn't really seeing. They won't stop, she said. No, he agreed. And you're okay with that? David folded the paper carefully. I've been waiting for it. Laura studied him. You don't act like someone defending a house. David met her eyes. I'm not. Then what? I'm defending a line, he said. Once it's crossed, it doesn't matter how much money you have. You don't get to pretend you didn't know better. Laura let that settle. You're teaching them a lesson. No, David replied quietly. I'm teaching Emily one. The days that followed brought small changes. A local hardware store extended credit without being asked. A neighbor dropped off spare lumber. A church group stopped by with casseroles and questions that were more curiosity than suspicion. The community slow to trust had noticed who stood their ground. Megan found steady work in town. Laura began sketching plans beyond repair ideas that hinted at something more permanent. Emily made friends with a girl down the road and argued over whose turn it was to ride bikes. The farmhouse felt less like a battleground and more like a beginning. One afternoon, as clouds rolled in heavy and dark, David stood alone in the barn, hands resting on a beam that would need replacing come spring. He closed his eyes and let the quiet press in. He thought of the man he had been, the deals he had made, the compromises he had justified. He thought of how close he'd come to becoming exactly what Prairie Ridge expected him to be. Behind him, footsteps approached. You look different when you're not fighting, Laura said. David turned. So do you. She smiled faintly. I'm starting to remember who I was before everything went wrong. David nodded. That's usually the dangerous part. The storm broke just after dusk. Rain hammered the roof loud and relentless. Emily curled up between Laura and Megan on the couch, eyes heavy, comforted by the sound. David watched them from the doorway, the fire casting shadows that felt less like threats now, and more like proof of life. Outside the road disappeared into darkness, slick and empty. Somewhere far beyond the fields, Prairie Ridge recalculated again, their maps no longer matching the ground beneath them. Inside the farmhouse, something steadier took hold. Not victory. Resolve. And for the first time since the papers had been signed, David allowed himself to imagine what might come next, not as a reaction, but as a choice. The hearing was scheduled for 9 in the morning, and by 8:30, the parking lot outside the courthouse was already half full. David arrived early, as he always did when something mattered. He parked between a rusted pickup and a county sedan, shut off the engine, and sat for a moment with his hands resting on the wheel. The courthouse brick was faded, the steps worn smooth by decades of people walking in, hopeful, and walking out, resigned. He had been inside that building before long ago, on the other side of the equation. Laura and Megan stepped out of the truck behind him. They both wore clean jackets, borrowed confidence, stitched over nerves they hadn't entirely shaken. Emily held Laura's hand, her other wrapped around the rabbit eyes wide as she took in the building. Is this where decisions happen? She asked. Yes, David said. Some of them. Inside the air was cool and dry. Voices echoed off high ceilings. A security guard nodded as they passed, recognition flickering briefly across his face before settling back into indifference. Down the hall, Prairie Ridge's legal team clustered near the courtroom doors, suits dark and immaculate. Ray Collins stood with them this time, posture stiff, jaw set. He looked up when David approached. Their eyes met. Ray's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. He had stopped smiling. Laura felt it immediately. She leaned slightly toward David. "They look ready." "So am I," David replied. The bailiff opened the doors and the room filled quickly. Reporters took seats near the back, not many, but enough. Local, curious, the kind who sensed a story without knowing where it led yet. The judge entered, and the room rose. When everyone sat again, the sound carried weight. Prairie Ridge spoke first. They always did. Their attorney's voice was smooth, practiced outlining concerns about environmental risk, unauthorized occupancy, child endangerment. Words chosen carefully, sharpened, just enough to cut without appearing to. Ray watched David the entire time, waiting for a reaction that never came. When it was David's turn, he stood without rushing. He didn't adjust his jacket. He didn't clear his throat. "My name is David Miller," he said. "I represent the Miller Property Trust." The judge glanced up. "You're representing yourself?" "No," David said calmly. "I'm representing the trust as its managing director." That earned a murmur. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Go on." David spoke without notes. He laid out the timeline. The legal purchase. The inspection cooperation. The attempted interference. He referenced documents, already filed evidence, already submitted. He spoke not like someone pleading a case, but like someone correcting a record. Prairie Ridge objected twice. Both objections were overruled. When David finished, the judge leaned back, fingers steepled. "Mr. Miller, are you asking this court to deny the injunction?" "Yes. And to allow continued occupancy during review?" "Yes." The judge nodded slowly. "On what grounds?" David met his gaze. "Because the law allows it, and because the alternative would reward bad faith." Silence followed, heavy, expectant. The judge glanced toward Prairie Ridge. Response. Their attorney stood, tension visible now. "Your Honor, this trust Mr. Miller references appears to be a shell created solely to obstruct." What David interrupted gently. The judge held up a hand. "Answer the question." The attorney faltered, then pressed on. "Obstruct a lawful acquisition process." David waited until the words settled, then spoke. "Your Honor, Prairie Ridge has acquired over 200 distressed properties in this county alone over the last decade. In each case, they leveraged regulatory pressure to force sale below market value. This trust exists to prevent that pattern from repeating here." The judge's eyes sharpened. "That's a serious allegation." "Yes," David said, "which is why I've provided documentation." The judge leafed through the file. The room held its breath. After a long moment, the judge looked up. Injunction denied. The sound that followed was subtle, but unmistakable. A collective release. Prairie Ridge's attorney sat down slowly. Ray's jaw clenched the first visible crack. Court adjourned shortly after. Outside reporters moved in asking questions David didn't answer. He walked past them with Emily's hand in his, Laura and Megan close behind. Only when they reached the steps did Ray catch up. "You think this ends it?" Ray said quietly. David stopped. He turned fully now, no longer avoiding the moment. "No," he said. "I think this begins it." Ray's eyes narrowed. "You've made enemies." David nodded once. "I already had them." Ray hesitated, then said what he'd been holding back. "They know who you are now." David leaned in just enough that Ray could hear him over the traffic. "They always did." Ray stepped back, something like uncertainty flickering across his face for the first time. He said nothing more. The drive home felt different, lighter. Not safe, but earned. Emily watched the fields roll past. Did the judge say yes? He said no. David replied. Emily frowned. "Isn't no bad?" David smiled faintly. "Not this time." At the farmhouse, the community was waiting. Neighbors, the church group. Tom Harris leaned against his truck, arms, crossed a grin he didn't bother to hide. "Well, Tom said that went about how I hoped." Laura looked around, overwhelmed. "They came, yes," Tom replied. "People notice when someone stands up." That evening, after the crowd dispersed and the house settled back into quiet, David sat alone on the porch. The sun dipped low, staining the fields gold and red. Laura joined him, then Megan sitting close enough to share the silence. "You could leave now," Laura said. "After all this." David didn't look at her. "I won't." Megan tilted her head. "Why not?" David considered the horizon. "Because the next part matters more." Inside, Emily laughed at something on the radio, a sound that carried easily through the open door. David listened, letting it fill the space where fear had lived for too long. Far away, Prairie Ridge would regroup. They always did. Lawyers would meet. Strategies would shift. Names would be spoken with less confidence than before. David Miller closed his eyes and breathed. The fight was no longer about a farmhouse. It was about what happened when people decided they could take without consequence. And he was ready for what came next. The letter came without ceremony, slipped into the mailbox on an ordinary afternoon, when the sky was clear and the road quiet. The kind of day that used to make David uneasy, because calm never lasted. He stood at the counter reading it, while Laura washed her hands and Megan sorted receipts at the table. The envelope was plain. No law firm logo, no threats wrapped in politeness, just paper ink and finality. Prairie Ridge Holdings formally withdrew all claims on the Miller property. No further action. No appeal. No conditions. David read it twice. Then once more. Megan broke the silence first. "That's it." "Yes," David said. "That's it." Laura dried her hands slowly, watching his face for something that didn't come. No celebration. No relief spilling over. Just a steady settling like a weight, finally placed where it belonged. Outside, Emily was riding her bike in uneven circles, wobbling and laughing, calling out every time she made it farther than before. David watched her through the window, the way her shoulders relaxed when she thought no one was looking. "They didn't win," Laura said. David folded the letter and set it aside. "They didn't lose," he replied. "They learned." The weeks that followed didn't announce themselves as an ending. Life simply continued, quieter now, sturdier. The inspections closed without findings. The utility accounts normalized. The phone stopped ringing with unknown numbers. David reopened the barn project, not as a defensive move, but as a plan. Laura's sketches turned into drawings. Megan's lists became schedules. Neighbors came by not to watch but to help. Lumber arrived without delays. Credit extended without being asked for. Emily grew taller, louder, braver. She stopped flinching at passing trucks. She slept through the night without the rabbit clenched in her fists. She learned the rhythm of the place and made it her own. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields in long shadows, David stood alone at the edge of the property, boots planted in soil that had nearly been taken from him by people who never intended to stand on it. He thought of the man he had been when he signed those papers 6 weeks before everything changed. Smaller, quieter, willing to disappear if it meant survival. That man didn't exist anymore. Laura joined him, hands tucked into her jacket pockets. "You're thinking again?" "Yes." "About leaving?" "No." He shook his head. "About staying?" She smiled, not surprised. "You don't run anymore." David exhaled. "I never really did. I just waited." Megan called from the porch, holding up a folder. "The permits are approved." David nodded once. "Good." That night they ate together at the table, the kind of meal that didn't need stretching or apologizing for. Emily talked about school, about a friend she'd made, about how she wanted to paint her room yellow because it felt like morning. Laura laughed, the sound easy now. Megan listened, adding details, making plans that extended beyond tomorrow. Later, after Emily fell asleep with a book open on her chest, David stood at her doorway longer than necessary. He watched her breathe, steady and unafraid, and felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Peace wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It just stayed. Weeks turned into months. The farmhouse changed not into something new, but into something honest. Solid. Lived in. It carried the marks of effort and intention. The land around it softened, no longer a point of contention, but a place of work and rest. One afternoon, a car pulled into the drive that David didn't recognize. A woman stepped out, cautious, holding a folder too tightly. She hesitated at the edge of the porch. "I was told you might understand," she said. David did. He always did now. That evening, after she left with directions and a promise, Laura sat beside him on the steps. "They're going to keep coming." "Yes. And you're going to keep saying yes." David looked out at the darkening fields. Not to everyone, just to the ones who need it. The farmhouse light glowed warm against the night. Inside, Megan cleaned the kitchen, humming softly. Emily slept dreaming of tomorrow, without knowing why it felt safer. David leaned back and closed his eyes. He had bought an abandoned farmhouse because he thought it was the last thing left to him. He had come back weeks later, expecting to reclaim a building. Instead, he had found a line worth holding. Not land, not money, not power. People. And sometimes he knew the strongest thing a man could do was refuse to step aside when the world expected him to. If this story stayed with you, if you believe that quiet courage still matters and that second chances are built, one decision at a time. Take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below with these 3 words: second chances matter.